The social sciences have been contaminated by an ideological infection. This infection has produced a contaminated framework where toxic masculinity is seen as the presumed root cause of nearly every social and societal problem. And as a result, the scientific research that follows is therefore not designed to interrogate that claim, but instead is designed to validate it. In this video, I'm going to be critically examining one of the most astonishingly flawed pieces of research literature that I've ever encountered. You guys are gonna die. And to be clear, we're talking about one random journal article. On its own, it's inconsequential. We don't actually care about this one paper, but we care about what this paper represents. This paper is a single sample that I have pulled from a much larger system. It is one vial taken from a polluted river. The sample is not the problem. The river is. Because this contaminated ideological river is flowing through academia, professional organizations, training programs, and institutions that shape therapy, education, and culture. And I want to be very clear about why I'm making this video and why I've created this channel. I want this infection out of the field that I love. I want social sciences to be a discipline that corrects for ideological drift, not one that institutionalizes it. When ideology is treated as evidence, social and behavioral science lose their credibility, and with it, their ability to understand human behavior at all. Any field that claims to want to benefit humanity must be willing to look at humanity honestly. And that means grounding our research methods in observable reality, not in moralized frameworks that cannot be tested, challenged, or falsified. My name is Gabriella, and I was educated explicitly and repeatedly in college and in graduate school to understand that patriarchy, and men more broadly, are the root cause of nearly all social and societal ill. What I can see now is that this way of thinking is not only intellectually weak, it's fundamentally anti-human, and I believe that it's actively contributing to the collapse of healthy masculinity in the West. This critique is not a defense of harmful masculine behavior, but is a defense of scientific integrity and honest inquiry. My goal in this video, and with this channel, is to open a more honest, scientifically grounded conversation about masculinity as a necessary, adaptive, and incredibly important force in any successful human civilization. Let's get into it. This paper's primary goal is instrument development. At its core, this paper is trying to do something reasonable. Take a vague, culturally loaded term, define it precisely, and then create a scale that can then be used to measure the construct. So the scale is developed and then it's validated exclusively in white men. The authors state that focusing on white men to validate the instrument was crucial, as traditional masculinity is often attributed to white masculine elites. So the implied logic here is that traditional masculinity has historically been associated with white masculine elites. Therefore, it is crucial to use white men as the appropriate validation sample for measuring toxic masculinity. But white masculine elites refers to a macro-level structural category, so like historical and institutional actors and political and economic power holders. But the actual people being used to validate the measurement are white male college students in 2024, who are not necessarily elite, they're not necessarily institutionally powerful, and they're not selected for any sort of elite status. So if the justification rests on this historical elite association, we need to know how the traditional masculinity of white masculine elites transmits and becomes the toxic masculinity that we see in white college students in 2024. Because if race alone is treated as sufficient proxy for inheritance of toxic masculinity, we need to know how elite level norms are transmitted racially and how that transmission is uniform across class. And we also need to understand how and whether or not these two things have been measured empirically, because otherwise there's a really significant transmission gap. Referencing a historical association is not a sufficient theoretical explanation for restricting validation to a racial group. If we are telling someone that they have toxic masculinity, we are saying that a part of their identity is toxic. My femininity is a really important part of my identity. I aspire to be feminine. And if somebody, especially in a position of authority, told me that my femininity was toxic or that I had toxic femininity, that would cause me distress. Telling someone that their gender expression is toxic is a serious accusation to be making about anyone. One of the most important ethical principles that is emphasized in social and behavioral sciences is the idea of cultural humility. And a big part of cultural humility is the idea that we shouldn't say that there is something pathological about you just because you belong to a specific racial category or are a specific gender. We would not ever want to do or think that. We would never want to say, oh yeah, people of your race have something toxic about them, so I'm going to make a scale and validate how toxic your people are. I'm not even going to use an example here because even like just using an example of how we might dehumanize somebody makes me uncomfortable. As a field, as a science, we've already decided that pathology should not be attributed to individuals on the basis of race or sex alone. Cultural humility, if it is to function as a genuine ethical standard, then it needs to apply symmetrically. Because otherwise, we are looking at the situation from a place of bias, and that's just not a good way to understand people. Also, the article that's cited to justify this sampling decision is not a psychometric validation paper. It is a high-level theoretical analysis. In this analysis, the authors are like, hey guys, what's up? So we've been looking over some of the literature about toxic masculinity, and we found that people are just not being very careful with that term. And we don't think that's a good idea. We don't think we should take toxic masculinity and say that it's specific to a race or take that idea out of context, because we don't want to collapse structural problems into individual male pathology, because it's just not a good way to look at things. Instead, we should focus on understanding things from a historical, geopolitical, and systemic point of view, rather than focusing on pathology of individual men. So our researchers read that and they said, okay, we hear what you're saying, and we are going to cite the part where you said traditional masculinity is often attributed to white masculine elites. But then we are going to go against everything you warned about when we create our scale by restricting the construct to a racial group, by taking all of these behaviors deeply out of context, and by collapsing structural problems into individual male pathology by validating it on individual men. So even if one accepts the broader theoretical framework and is like, yes, this is correct, we should only be testing white men, importing macro-level claims into a micro-level psychometric instrument requires an explicit bridge, and there is not one here. So if structural theory is used to justify individual level measurement within a racial category, then we need a really strong theoretical bridge. Not one of these, or one of these. We need one of these. If you're going to make the case that white men should be tested for toxic masculinity because traditional masculinity is associated with white masculine elites, that claim needs a very clear theoretical explanation. Let's all say it together. You cannot build an empirical instrument on an incoherent theoretical foundation that's rooted in ideology. My God, that was awful. I wonder if that's why I never made the cheer team. Oof. Anyway, let's get into the science. The very first step in building a scale like this is a definition. And before you can measure toxic masculinity, you have to define masculinity itself. And this is where I want to pause, because I, Gabriella, actually do have a definition. I developed this definition through years of studying developmental psychology, sociology of gender, biology, anthropology, studying masculinity cross-culturally, and working with men in a therapeutic capacity, as well as observing how men adapt to real-world pressure. Here is how I define masculinity. Masculinity is a form of contextual intelligence that emerges from necessity. It is shaped by threat, constraint, and survival context. Humans are tribal, and masculinity functions as the rule set for the men within the tribe. The expectations placed on men by men and women to promote safety, continuity, and survival. The responsibilities of the men in the tribe are shaped by what must be faced, endured, and protected. Masculinity is an adaptive system, one that changes depending upon the demands placed on it. I have honestly spent years trying to shape that definition in my mind, and I'm not even a researcher, but I can see how important it is to have that construct well defined if I'm choosing to talk about masculinity. So the researchers presumably also understand that they need to be extremely careful in how they define masculinity, because that definition becomes the foundation of their entire instrument. They decided to define masculinity by asking some college kids what they thought masculinity was. Their foundational definition of masculinity came from an undergraduate survey, and most of the sampling pool was of college women. Because who among us could understand masculinity more than a group of mostly female college students on a very liberal campus. So, now that we've defined masculinity, we are now able to define toxic masculinity. Let's start with where the term toxic masculinity comes from. The paper traces the concept back to Shepherd Bliss, a man who was trying to make sense of his father's harsh authoritarian behavior. This was a man who was shaped by military life and war. And to be clear, we're a big fan of Shepherd Bliss on this channel. He cared deeply about men's suffering in a way that was rare for his time. Bliss wasn't responding to masculinity in the abstract. He was responding to the visible psychological devastation of Vietnam veterans. He saw these men and realized how much they had been affected by exposure to violence, obedience under threat of serious danger, and constant proximity to death. In other words, what he was witnessing looks a lot like unprocessed grief, trauma, and PTSD, expressed through authority, emotional shutdown, and rigidity. Bliss was on the right track here. But it does make me really raise the question of, was he observing toxic masculinity, or was he observing what happens to men when they're traumatized en masse? If I were studying this construct seriously, I would not start out by labeling the outcome toxic masculinity. If I wanted to build upon Bliss's work, I would study what happens when men are required to risk their lives for the health of the group. What happens when obedience, hardness, and suppression are adaptive? And what happens when men are repeatedly asked to sacrifice their bodies, their safety, and their humanity for collective survival? I would study the effect of male trauma at the group level, because when a context requires men to endure what is impossible to endure, to kill, to witness death, to absorb horror, and to remain functional anyway, the resulting behaviors aren't some ideology, they're adaptations. And when those adaptations are carried back into civilian life without processing, without reintegration, they don't just magically disappear. They calcify into authoritarianism, emotional shutdown, and hyper-control. These behaviors don't emerge from masculinity. They emerge when survival strategies outlive the context that required them. So when we skip that entire analysis, when we don't ask what happened to men before asking what's wrong with them, we risk arriving at a definition that isn't accurate. Before we call something toxic masculinity, we should ask whether or not we're looking at masculinity or the consequence of a force that traumatized men en masse. That is what I would study carefully before even thinking about creating a definition for toxic masculinity. So how did these researchers define toxic masculinity? They decided to define toxic masculinity by asking some college kids what they thought toxic masculinity was. This is the foundation of their instrument. So whatever these college students believe that toxic masculinity is, becomes the basis for this entire measurement. The researchers then qualitatively analyzed these responses using thematic coding, which they described as a grounded, theory-informed approach. Grounded theory is designed to allow theoretical categories to emerge from the data rather than begin with normative assumptions about the subject being studied. Despite invoking grounded theory, the resulting definition mirrors the normative framing that preceded the analysis. But anyway, the authors took the answers from our co-eds and came up with the following definition. Toxic masculinity is the overemphasis and indulgence in society-based masculine traits to an extent that is harmful to oneself and/or others. What is toxic masculinity? Masculinity that is harmful. Why is the masculinity harmful? Because it's toxic masculinity. What is toxic masculinity? Wait a minute. This definition has no independent empirical anchor. There is no external baseline, no population norms, no cross-cultural comparison, and no functional outcomes. Without a reference point, deviation cannot be measured. So the scale doesn't measure toxic masculinity, it's measuring how much you engage in a behavior that is disapproved of by the group of people who responded to the survey. The phrase societal-based is equally vague. Which society? Which class? Which cultural framework? Without clear reference points, the construct functions as like a norm policing device, not a behavioral measurement. What is being measured here is attitudinal conformity, not toxic masculinity. Harm is also treated as self-evident rather than context-dependent. But in behavioral science, harm is always going to be conditional, and it's going to be dependent on the context, the time horizon, the risks, and the alternatives. Like, for instance, emotional restraint might be really functional when you're in combat or when you're in a life or death situation, and that same emotional restraint might really be ineffective in an intimate relationship. And this definition collapses all of that. And let's talk about the use of the word indulgence. The term indulgence carries moral weight. That's not a neutral word. It assumes that toxic masculine traits are expressed only for pleasure, not as a response to responsibility, scarcity, trauma, or survival strategy. Remember, under this definition, emotional shutdown or restraint after trauma is treated as an indulgence. We can just think about a combat veteran coming back from war being like, you know, I just watched my friend bleed out in front of me. I think it's time to kick back and indulge in some toxic masculinity. What? This definition replaces context with judgment and calls the result masculine pathology. And finally, this definition labels behavior but refuses to ask why it exists. It doesn't ask, what problem is this trait solving? What context selected for it? What threat made it adaptive? Masculinity is positioned as the cause of harm rather than as a response to threat, expectation, survival pressure, or trauma. Rather than asking how masculine traits emerge in response to environmental demands, the definition treats masculinity itself as the explanatory agent. This is a fundamental attribution error that is embedded directly into the definition itself. What results is not a testable theory, but a closed framework that cannot be falsified. This is a moral narrative presented in the language of science. Hello, 911? I don't know what to do. They're freezing ideology into measurement and they're calling the result peer-reviewed science. From the themes that emerged, the research team then generated a pool of 165 proposed scale items. This is my favorite part. They then take the 165 items and have them reviewed by 6 content experts who decided which items should stay and which should be removed. But here's what's hilarious. Who are the 6 content experts? We don't know. The paper never tells us. We don't know what content they're experts in. We don't know what their disciplines are. We don't know if they're clinicians, researchers, or graduate students. We don't know whether they specialized in feminist theory or gender studies or men's psychology. I mean, I don't think it was that one. Or we also don't know if there was any ideological diversity among the experts. I mean, but we could probably guess on that one as well. To be perfectly clear, I'm sure that the 6 experts are incredibly qualified, but we just don't know what they're qualified in. At this stage, construct validity hinges not on transparent methodology, but on an appeal to the authority of a small anonymous group. I thought the whole point of the scientific method was so that our knowledge wouldn't depend on appealing to a small group of anonymous experts as arbiters of truth. So anyway, the experts then reduced the questions from 165 to 108 by removing questions that are not aligned with the researcher's definition of toxic masculinity, inappropriately worded, loaded, double-barreled, or reductive. Notably, the first exclusion criterion ensures that any item challenging the original constructed definition is eliminated by design. That means that items that did not fit within the initial conceptual framing are removed during a refinement stage. So the scale is no longer being refined to test or to measure a construct, it's being redefined to conform to one, which is fine. But if you're going to be creating a definition that's going to measure something, maybe we should be just a little bit more careful with the definition. Why don't we have the 6 experts just double check to make sure that you've defined this construct correctly because it's the basis of your measurement? And the 6 experts are right there. I don't know, why don't you just have them check your work? It seems like that might be a a good idea. It just feels careless not to have any expert input on how you're defining this. Now let's go through the scale items. Respondents are asked to agree or disagree with a series of statements, and from those responses, we can then determine how much toxic masculinity a person possesses. If I cry, I am weak. Crying means I am weak. Expressing sadness publicly makes me weak. Displays of sadness mean I am not masculine. This is less of a psychological scale and more of a thesaurus exercise. Let's take the scale item, public displays of sadness mean that I am not masculine. What does that actually mean? Doesn't that depend on what kind of display, where you are, what just happened? Context is doing all of the work here, and the scale ignores it entirely. And, the scale does say that women can have their own traits of toxic masculinity, so I may lose subscribers by displaying my own traits of toxic masculinity by saying this. But if you're a grown man standing in front of me at Starbucks and they run out of glitter for your unicorn refresher and you start openly sobbing and that's the only reason that you're crying, I am very sorry to say, but I am most likely not going to think that you are the pinnacle of masculine strength. And that judgment actually has nothing to do with pathology, and it has everything to do with context, regulation, and appropriateness. According to this scale, a man crying at his father's funeral is functionally the same as the man in front of me crying because Starbucks ran out of glitter. Those are not the same behavior or the same responses, but they would be measured in the same way on this scale. Repressed suffering. If I am in pain, I don't let people know. I ignore pain when I feel it. If I am sick, I refuse to go to the doctor. And if I don't feel well, I just ignore it. And we're so close to seeing it here. Why might someone refuse to go to the doctor? Maybe it's because their masculinity is toxic. Or maybe it's because they can't afford to. Maybe it's because they can't afford to miss work or they don't have health insurance. Maybe it's because healthcare isn't accessible. What about ignoring pain? Why are we going to say that that's automatically a symptom of toxic masculinity? Maybe it's because you're poor and you can't afford the time and resource that it would take to treat that pain. What if it's because you have chronic pain, so you're just always in pain? What if it's because you have a lifetime of learning that admitting pain doesn't bring help? If I don't feel well, I just ignore it. You mean somebody with a job? Or with kids? Or with people depending on them? That's not identity pathology. That's endurance under constraint. This scale continues to mistake adaptation for dysfunction. It takes behaviors that are more than likely shaped by scarcity, trauma, and responsibility and attributes them to toxic masculinity. That's not psychological insight, that's misattribution. Okay, on to masculine superiority. Men are superior to women. Superior in what? This is where the problem starts, because if you don't specify a domain, you're not measuring a belief. You're measuring how someone responds to a cartoonishly vague statement. Because anybody with 2 brain cells is going to immediately ask, superior at what? Physical strength? Childbirth? Spatial reasoning? Risk tolerance? Because most people understand something very basic, which is that on average, there are things that men tend to be better at, and there are things that women tend to be better at. So who does agree with a statement this cartoonishly vague? I think somebody whose internal reasoning process is roughly, me no like women, women bad, men good. If your item can't survive basic clarification, then it shouldn't be on a scale. Let me show you what a more effective psychological measurement would look like. Because a real psych question is never going to look like men are superior to women. That's not a psychological question. That's an Andrew Tate quote. Real psychological measures are going to specify the domain, the context, the behavior, the time frame, and generally the internal experience. Because psychology measures patterns. Here, I rewrote some of these questions to demonstrate how these questions should look if we were actually trying to measure something specifically. Do you see how this measurement might produce an answer that is more meaningful than the answer you might get to this question? It's hard though, because if the authors of this study might see this, I might get selected to be the next expert. So if you guys stay up to date in the toxic masculinity scale development literature and you see that there are 7 experts next time, don't say anything to anyone. The last section of questions measure gender rigidity. Gender and sex are the same thing. There are only two genders. Gender is not different from sex, and it is propaganda that there are more than two genders. This factor measures belief alignment with contemporary gender theory. Psychological scales are not supposed to test whether or not you've accepted a particular sociological framework, unless that's what they're specifically trying to test. If you don't agree with our framing of society, then that means that something is wrong with you. That isn't a measurement. That's ideological compliance testing. And now for my favorite one. Sex work isn't a career. This one just came out of left field. What do your beliefs about whether sex work is a career or not have to do with your masculinity? What do they mean by isn't a career? Like, isn't a legitimate career? I'm so confused. So theoretically, viewing sex work as a career means that you have psychologically healthier masculinity compared to somebody who does not view sex work as a career.
While I understand that sex work is a reality, I do not believe it should be treated as a typical career path. Treating it as ordinary risks, minimizing the psychological, relational, and economic harms that sex workers disproportionately experience. Sex work is also uniquely exploitative, as it disproportionately draws from people who are economically or socially vulnerable. A responsible society can respect the dignity of sex workers while still being honest about the risks of the industry. For these reasons, I do not believe sex work should be normalized as a typical career path.
He's toxic! Get him out of here! After the survey, they run a bunch of statistical tests to make sure that the scale measures what it's supposed to measure. All the usual psychometric steps. And I'm not going to spend any time here because this isn't where the problem is. In the same way that a scale measures pounds or a ruler measures inches, this scale does a very good job of measuring toxic masculinity. As defined largely by a group of college women at Oregon State and then refined and validated by 6 anonymous experts. Psychometrics can tell you whether your items hang together, but they can't tell you whether the thing you're testing actually corresponds to reality. Human beings do not understand the world through data or numbers. We understand the world through story. So if we want to understand the ideological infection, we do need to understand that it is a story. Let me tell you that story. Men, especially white men, are presumed to have an internal pathology. In the story, this pathology inside of them is labeled as toxic masculinity. In this story, their toxicity expresses itself as a desire for power. Power, however, is defined narrowly and incredibly pessimistically. Through this lens, the masculine drive to achieve is never understood as a willingness to adopt responsibility, a desire to serve one's community, or a willingness to carry burden. The masculine desire to achieve and to be successful is only seen as a drive to dominate, to control, and to oppress others. Once the framing of that story is accepted, and white men are positioned as the primary oppressor to everyone else, measuring their presumed drive to oppress marginalized groups can be seen as a necessary act of protection. Within this story, because white men are the group most associated with toxic masculinity, it is acceptable to categorize them based on their race and their gender. Doing so is not seen as any form of prejudice or any form of bias, but instead it's seen as a morally justified recognition of the truth. What I see in this paper is a framework that is animated by an institutionalized form of revenge logic. That spirit of contempt is incompatible with accurately understanding human beings. And this is the sick irony that brings out my mama bear. This work, along with much of the contemporary literature on toxic masculinity, invokes Shepherd Bliss as a historical reference point. They say his name so that they can be like, oh yeah, we're connecting our work to this guy who really cared about men. It gives them conceptual and historical credibility. But as with most of the modern work on toxic masculinity, this paper is not an extension of Bliss's work, it's actually a reversal of it. Bliss's work emerged from concern about men who are visibly suffering, men who are shaped by war, death, betrayal, and responsibility. His question was essentially, what happened to these men and how do we help them come back to us? His question and his work were rooted in genuine care. This scale is both a mockery and a bastardization of his work. This paper and this scale do not try to help understand men or understand how they're hurting. It does not ask what men have endured, adapted to, or how they've survived. Instead, it asks whether or not men agree with a set of morally preloaded beliefs, and then treats disagreement as evidence that their masculinity has become toxic. What began as an effort to understand male pain has been transformed into a mechanism for moral sorting. And if you couldn't already tell this from this video or this channel, I care deeply about this, because at the core of my work is a very simple conviction. I like humans. I'm a fan of humanity. I think humanity is really cool. And frameworks that refuse to view men as anything other than power-hungry oppressors, that pathologize people instead of trying to understand them, and that decide humans are toxic based on their gender or the color of their skin are at their core anti-human. So, I will do my part to continue to expose this infection that has overtaken far too many institutions, by advocating for a way of understanding ourselves and understanding humanity, in a way that's driven by curiosity and care. If you value my work and you would like to support my mission, I have some links below. I really appreciate it, and I also appreciate all of the support that you guys give me. And because we already know the theme of my channel is going to get me called this name so many times, I'm just gonna capitalize on it and say that you should pick me by liking and subscribing to my channel.
So pick me. Choose me.
Subscribe to
Me.
and I will see you in the next one.